Okay, hello, and welcome to today's session on sustainable infrastructure. My name is Armando Balbuena, Marketing Manager here at Sonen Capital, and your moderator for today's webinar. Your participation is highly encouraged. Please do submit questions using the questions panel. Throughout the presentation, we'll be reviewing questions coming in and answer as many as we can at the end. Those questions that remain unanswered will be addressed and emailed out to everyone, along with the link to the audio recording of the webinar. We appreciate and absolutely respect your time. So from start to finish, we're aiming at a 30-minute webinar. For those of you just joining us, this webinar is based on our continuing series of impact investing frameworks, all of which can be found in the thought leadership section of our website. To date, we've published impact frameworks on energy, water, agriculture, real estate, and topics for faith-based and divestment investors. In each framework, we identify the major social and environmental drivers that we observe are related to each theme and how those drivers relate to or potentially create impact investment opportunities in public and private markets. We develop these impact frameworks to better understand nuances, investment opportunities, and really to develop guidelines for specific themes of interest to investors. And through no coincidence at all, I'm here with Sonen Capital's Head of Impact, Will Morgan. He is the architect of these guidelines. Will's been working in the field of impact measurement for about 15 years. He leads Sonen's efforts to define, evaluate, and report impact across Sonen's public and private market investment strategies. Will?
Thanks, Armando, and hi, everybody. We're glad to have this topic today and discuss this. We've already heard from a number of you regarding how timely this webinar is, just with respect to infrastructure being front and center in Washington.
It is timely indeed, Will. And interesting to note that during the U.S. presidential election, one of the few areas that both candidates actually agreed on was that infrastructure needed to be a priority, with both candidates calling for massive investments. The new administration has called for up to $1 trillion in spending to repair and upgrade the U.S.'s infrastructure, stating that the nation needs to rebuild, quote, crumbling roads and bridges, expand telecommunications networks, and repair aging water systems. To better contextualize the administration's description of quote-unquote crumbling infrastructure, we looked for and found a document detailing potential projects totaling about $138 billion, or about 14% of the proposed spend. This document lists 50 projects like bridges, dams, trains, and energy transmission, all of which give a good idea of what potentially $1 trillion can buy. However, according to many estimates, $1 trillion is not enough.
Yeah, Armando, I'll just chime in here and note that at least none of these projects that we looked through include things like coal-fired power generation, so we think that is encouraging. To segue a little bit of background, recently the American Society of Civil Engineers gave America's infrastructure a grade of only a D+, and they estimated that in order not to have a series of cascading infrastructure failures and incidents, the investment that we need to accomplish by 2020 totals $3.6 trillion. Ultimately, we think there's bipartisan agreement, which suggests that some of this spending may actually take place, and there might be a higher chance of this actually getting through the legislature.
Well, outside of the U.S., though, infrastructure is seen as a way to invigorate sluggish global markets, with optimism actually being fueled by the increasing willingness by governments to support private sector investment in infrastructure. In 2016, investments in global infrastructure assets hit a record $413 billion. And although the value of those deals rose 14% from 2015, the number of deals held steady, which shows that there's a surplus of money chasing too few projects. And while unemployment in the U.S. is around 4.6%, that figure is just a bit over double in Europe at about 9.8% unemployment, which also makes infrastructure job creation in Europe and emerging markets much more attractive. Ultimately, rapid urbanization, population growth, and aging systems, all of this is part of the global need for infrastructure spending. Globally, $90 trillion in infrastructure is required over the next 10 to 15 years in order to even meet the projected needs.
So when we hear the figure of $90 trillion as impact investors, we consider both the investment opportunity that presents and more prominently the extraordinary impact opportunity that it presents. The choices we make about infrastructure now carry enormous consequence for the health and the well-being of our planet, socially, economically, and environmentally. So in this framework, we've identified how the right investing in infrastructure can actually create positive social, economic, and environmental outcomes. Because in Sonen's view, this amounts to sustainable infrastructure.
Will?
Yeah.
Hang on one second. So for those on the phone looking at a screen, contextualize this for us. What does the right, I made air quotes just so you know, investing in infrastructure mean?
Oh, okay. All right. So think or consider, if we were to build a new coal-fired power plant or build a 10-lane highway. This spends valuable resources, a large amount of resources now, and it locks in these high carbon and unsustainable ways of providing critical services to our civilization. So we think as we consider future needs and requirements for our society across the planet, a more sustainable alternative looking forward is probably renewable energy power generation and low carbon mass transit that can service millions instead. I hope that clarifies. Just to further elaborate on that a little bit, here's how we define sustainable infrastructure along three dimensions: social, economic, and environmental. First, socially sustainable means that we're expanding services where they're needed most, and as a consequence, helping to widen economic opportunity for many people around the planet who don't currently have it. Economically sustainable means that we want to ensure that the services that are rendered are affordable, both for the end users as well as for local and federal governments. And environmentally sustainable means infrastructure decisions that help preserve and conserve natural systems and ecosystems and their unique ability to provide essential infrastructure-like services. One of my favorite things about doing some of these frameworks is we get to do a lot of research and educate ourselves about what the context is in which we're working. And here's a few more background points to provide some context. As I mentioned before, Armando did, globally we need to spend $90 trillion by 2030 to maintain and expand infrastructure. One of the things I think is interesting is that that figure represents more than the total current stock of infrastructure that's already in place. So everything we see now will be eclipsed by this future infrastructure that we'll see in the next 15 years. Next, the Global South is going to account for roughly 2/3 of that infrastructure investment. That's largely due to where the population growth is going to happen. And here, this is an opportunity to leapfrog the inefficient investment or inefficient and polluting systems that we have in the past. I kind of think of it as how cell phones are more ubiquitous in emerging markets than in landlines. The emerging markets in those economies essentially just leapfrogged that old and antiquated and expensive system, and now they're using this much more efficient system of mobile communications. Next, pointing to the potential, the impact potential of the right kind of sustainable infrastructure investment, this is where we can see that it could yield really very tangible and positive benefits. In 2014, nearly 90 million tons of municipal solid waste was recycled and composted and repurposed into energy, and that's enough energy to power 10 million households for a year. Imagine if we could build more waste infrastructure like that and get more out of our waste. And last, an interesting factoid from the United Nations. If we increase tree cover in urban environments in particular by 10%, that can reduce heating and cooling requirements by between 5 and 10% as a result. A simple intervention with very tangible results. So because infrastructure is so broad, we define it in this context to be comprised of six key sectors. We define specific impact objectives that are germane for each of those sectors and that really just articulate the impact that we want to have as we invest in transit and sanitation and water. Earlier impact frameworks that we've published have covered energy, water, and some of our environmental goals as they relate to investing in real assets. In this infrastructure framework, we also list our impact objectives for transportation, for sanitation, and for telecommunications. For example, in sanitation-related investments, we want to aim to expand waste management practices that includes greater use of recycling, composting, and otherwise getting more out of the enormous amounts of municipal solid waste that we generate around the world.
Will, I'm going to throw in a plug here for our impact framework content, and because someone asked a question. These frameworks are all abbreviated on the slides here, but more detail can be found on each respective framework on our website, sonencapital.com. Go to the thought leadership section and you'll see them all there.
Thanks, Armando. I like a plug. Okay, so as in our other frameworks, we identify our intended impact outcomes that will result from our investments. In infrastructure, we've identified 3 specific outcomes and corresponding investment strategies that will help us get to those goals. First, with social impact, the outcome that we intend to create as a result of our investing is to increase social equity, largely through increased access and affordability of modern infrastructure services. Supporting impact objectives for that outcome are spending and investing in investment in the geographies where it's needed most. And as we all know, in many parts of the world, there are places that simply don't have decent infrastructure or any infrastructure in some cases. And next, we want to improve the sustainability performance of urban infrastructure in the urban environment. That's where the vast majority of infrastructure spending will take place, and thus it presents a greater opportunity to get more impact as a result. So some of the sample investments that we think will support this outcome are things like power grid expansion, just reaching more people, particularly with renewable energy solutions. We want to target distributed energy solutions. This is where you're putting the power generation much closer to the end user, on the top of rooftops, on commercial buildings, for example. And we want to expand and improve waste and sanitation services and telecommunications. The next intended outcome relates to the climate. Here, what we want to do is support low carbon development, and supporting impact objectives there include promoting clean energy power generation, expanding the availability of low carbon transportation, and capturing some of the potential from solid waste, as I mentioned a couple of moments ago. Some sample investments that would typify this objective include technologies or practices that can help transform waste into resources. This includes biogasification, waste to energy, composting, recycling. And this can also include bonds that can finance the expansion or the retrofit of transportation systems with low or no carbon emissions. We're seeing lots of that kind of opportunity in Asia and Southeast Asia, where federal governments are investing in mass transit solutions rather than just building more highways. Last is environmental impact. Here, our impact outcome that we intend to create is to see increased conservation of natural resources and more so-called natural infrastructure. Corresponding investment objectives for this outcome are fairly straightforward. We really want to invest in the types of natural infrastructure that can help capture some of the financial and ecological benefits that these natural ecosystems provide. Typical examples of this would be green bonds that can finance the restoration of natural waterways or coastal ecosystems, We see other financing mechanisms that can integrate natural infrastructure into urban design and planning, which is a new idea, but it's really starting to take hold.
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
I think, again, examples are important here. Can you put this a little bit more into context for us?
Yeah. Yes. So natural infrastructure, I think we just read about a really interesting example of this in Philadelphia. So it has, over the many years that it's been in place and expanded, it's having stormwater overflow issues, and they're trying to address that with putting in porous parking surfaces. So this is an effort to help water that comes from the sky enter into the natural cycle in the ground rather than just being shuttled into a culvert and into a waterway and out into the river. They're also restoring and rehabilitating nearby wetlands because wetlands absorb rainwater and improve the watershed health. Another typical example is just coastal restoration. It turns out that mangroves are a whole lot cheaper than building levees and dikes and a series of pumping stations to keep water and stormwater surge out of an area. And the mangroves also have a big, important ecological role to play. So I hope that helps clarify that.
Indeed. Thank you.
I wanted to comment on Sonen's efforts to align its investments and its strategy with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is a series of 17 goals which are intended by the year 2030 to bring our planet to social, economic, and environmental sustainability. One of those goals, number 9, specifically addresses infrastructure investing. So wherever we can, we're mapping our own investments not only to the broad goal of infrastructure, but also we're examining the underlying targets for each of these goals and the impact indicators that will help us all assess our success and our contribution. 2 of the targets for SDG 9 are written here. One is to invest for more sustainable and resilient infrastructure with a focus on affordability and equitable access, which is something that's echoed in our own intended impact outcomes. And second is a larger focus on resource efficiency and the use of environmentally sound technologies. So again, wherever we can, we map our investments in as granular and as specific a fashion as we can to understand how some of these investments are contributing very specifically to the Sustainable Development Agenda. So the last element of our impact frameworks are what we call the guidelines, and these are simply a way for us to articulate our position on specific issues as they relate to the impact theme, in this case, infrastructure. The intention here is to just clearly state where we stand on any particular issue, particularly for some of those topics that may be controversial or have many different and very strong opinions about them. So to illustrate this process, we're just going to go through 3 of these to show you how we consider and how we form an opinion on this. We're going to walk through water storage, airports, and car parking just in a couple minutes here. Starting with water storage, we know that water storage is a vital component of infrastructure, and it can be an important component of sustainable infrastructure. And so in this case, what we want to do is invest in the right technologies or the right projects that help us power our civilization more efficiently, but not at the expense of something else. So oftentimes these large-scale water storage programs and hydropower facilities inundate sensitive ecosystems, or they otherwise compromise ecological integrity, and that's where we want to weigh each of these potential investments with that cost and understand if the benefit is worth that cost. And oftentimes inundating a river valley is not something that comes out in a net benefit for us, in our view. Next is airports. We know air travel is a huge and growing part of global commerce, and it's also very carbon intensive. And it doesn't, in our view, represent what we would call the optimal use of an impact dollar. So thus, we won't invest in new airports or greenfield development or a runway expansion. But we could imagine, for example, investing in a bond that retrofits an existing airport and improves the sustainability performance of that facility in a very meaningful and measurable way. And last, parking lots is the very common element of many infrastructure investors' vision. And again, we don't think building more places to park more cars is the highest and best use of an impact dollar, and therefore we don't wish to see this kind of thing figure prominently in any of our investments. But it may qualify where it enables and expands mass transit solutions. And even in these cases where it's helping people get to a mass transit facility, we would like and we intend to have this be a tiny and de minimis exposure of any investment strategy. So our guidelines are more comprehensive in the actual framework. You saw the actual content a couple slides ago, but I hope this illustrates how we try to be as specific as possible and how we'll invest in some of these things.
Thanks, Will. Let's get to questions. We had a few come in over email, several in the questions panel, and some folks who could not be here with us sent us some over email. So let's begin. Loaded question number one on the timeliness factor here. Will, this question's for you. The Trump administration discusses big investment in infrastructure, but I haven't seen anything about low carbon or sustainable infrastructure. Is this on the administration's radar?
To our knowledge, it is not. You know, the literature that has come out and that has been released and that we shared with you a moment ago seems to have a larger focus on the conventional sectors, highways, bridges, tunnels. To us, it doesn't appear that climate change seems to be a big priority. So we may have kind of a tough row to hoe there with respect to advancing a more explicit focus on sustainability in infrastructure. But having said that, of those 50 top priority projects that we reviewed, there were none that were about coal-powered energy generation, which we think is a good sign. There were some about natural gas infrastructure, which is oftentimes considered a bridge fuel to a more cleaner, less carbon-intensive economy. I will say, though, those are the projects that are prioritized in the United States. Overseas, where much of this infrastructure spending will take place, it's hard to understand what kind of priority sustainable infrastructure may have. And I think that's where we're trying to continue to make the case that as you invest in these quote unquote right sustainable investments, we can see an impact and a social and an economic and environmental dividend that comes along with integrating these ideas of sustainability in these decisions.
Another question from the panel here. Are there other kinds of infrastructure or investments in infrastructure that don't include big projects or huge amount of spending? How do we pursue more positive impact but without spending billions of dollars?
Well, that's a great question. And yes, I mean, typically, you know, we throw these numbers around of 130 billion and 90 trillion. And it's, you know, typically when we think of infrastructure investments, we think of big, large-scale projects, both and huge expenses. But there are lots of ways to skin this cat, and you know, through our research, we've discovered that investments in so-called run-of-the-mill public equity fixed income opportunities can actually help be a part of building sustainable infrastructure. I'm thinking of smart technologies that can help increase energy efficiency or water use, and one exciting thing is, you know, what they call smart city infrastructure. And those are things like technologies that help optimize energy use in street lights and traffic patterns. So when there's low traffic and the lights just kind of automate and turn on and off as needed, and those can yield significant positive impacts for sustainability. And like I said, this doesn't have to, you know, for investors to participate, they don't have to be shelling out huge amounts of capital. They can be investing in run-of-the-mill or very targeted public equity and targeted fixed income securities, which are peripherally involved but making a very substantive contribution to the sustainability agenda.
This next question kind of goes off of the last one. I'm not sure you have the full expertise of this, but I'd love your opinion. What future technologies are needed to address sustainable infrastructure?
Well, yeah, so much of what I just talked about, the smart city technologies, optimizing water and energy use, smart meters, that kind of thing. There's just such a huge world of opportunity. Even in real estate and buildings, we're seeing all this new technology come out that can help really insulate buildings better, help them improve their energy efficiency and performance, and just through window coatings and solar arrays on the roof and stuff. One thing we're looking at is driverless cars. You know, this seems to be the wave of the future, particularly in Silicon Valley, and that could have a big effect on infrastructure. There could be fewer accidents, less stress on roadways, less congestion, maybe cleaner air, cars that are more using less fuel, and also we've seen some potential where this kind of technology development can develop some meaningful partnerships and cooperation between companies and municipalities and even the end users. So I think, you know, we need to change our attitude about travel. We can't just think about moving people in cars. We need to think about designing transportation for entire communities, not just for cars. I'm not sure if that answered the question adequately.
We appreciate your input. One that comes from the questions panel. What's Sonen's view on privately owned infrastructure or private investors taking control of such essential services?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that's top of mind for us, and that's why we specifically include in our guidelines and some of our language that we want these investments to be economically sustainable. And so that really means affordability to the end user, and it means affordability for local municipalities. I think the first thing most people think of when they think of private investors taking control of what would otherwise be a public asset or a public good is that they could be excessively usurious in charging fees and then end up making a whole bunch of money and not really expanding services to the people who need it most. So we're very cognizant of that, and that's a very explicit part of our investment consideration. We do think private investors, they just have to be a part of investing in infrastructure just as a function of mathematics, and the UN Sustainable Development Agenda is actively encouraging the role of the private sector and private asset owners in helping build out a sustainable future. So we think that's a good sign. But again, in order that it meets our definition of sustainability, we have to ensure the services aren't unaffordable and that the expansion of these services really meets the need of everybody, in particularly disadvantaged populations who have not been able to avail themselves of such basic services that we are all used to in this country.
Here's one on the Sustainable Development Goals. It says, Will, you've talked a lot about investments in water and sanitation and cities, but here you're only noting the alignment with SDG 9. Why?
Yeah, well, so of those 17 goals, one of them is infrastructure, and there's other ones relating to energy and water, and even one about cities specifically. And there's just a lot of overlap. Excuse me. There's a lot of overlap between many of these goals, and our intention here, you know, since the SDGs came out, a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon, which we think is a good thing, and trying to illustrate the alignment of their investment strategy with the SDGs. And again, we think that's good, and that's our intention too. But it's really easy to say, if you're an investor in parking lots or highways, that you're an infrastructure investor, and thus you can put that seal of approval and that badge on your marketing documents. But if you look at the more targeted parts of the goals, and each of the goals has a series of 4 or 5 underlying targets, which really specify how we will get to that goal. And then you can go a layer even deeper to specific indicators that the UN has suggested that we all use to evaluate our success and contribution to that overarching goal. And Sonen is taking an attempt to be very focused on any investment in infrastructure that we think contributes to the SDG 9's targets and that can be measurable or through the specific indicators that are germane to that target. That's how we're pursuing this. So it's a much more granular and targeted pursuit than simply saying any infrastructure investment qualifies. It needs to meet some sustainability characteristics in our view in order for us to say that it's actually making the right contribution to the sustainability agenda.
Thank you very much, Will. We've promised you a half hour. This is all the time we have for the webinar today. But please look at our follow-up email that's going to alert you to the on-demand status of the webinar and answer any remaining questions. Last time we had, I think, a dozen questions we had not yet answered, and we sent our responses in an email. So we appreciate your questions, and we will absolutely get to them. On behalf of Will Morgan, as well as the Sonen team, thank you for joining us. We hope we've added to your knowledge on the topic. Until next time, my name is Armando Balbuena. Have an excellent day. Thank you.